Welcome back to the studio. We're in TU Delft and we're going to be discussing Gary Boll's video that you've just seen. In the studio with me, just as a reminder, we have Connie Bakker from TU Delft. Welcome. We have Joe Miller from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and we have Alexander Lemille from the the Circular Economy Africa Network. So we'll have seen that Gary was talking about unbundling education and in effect breaking it down and then allowing it to reform. But what direction does this have to take? I think that's one of the key questions that we have to discuss, and we're going to talk about that now. So Connie, what do you think the purpose of education actually is? If we're going to reform education, in what direction should it be reformed?
Wow. Purpose of education first. Thinking, well, just going back to the really fundamentals of why we educate people at all is, I think, deep down, it's to satisfy curiosity. It's just, everybody is a curious mind, I think, to some extent. And if there would be nothing like a higher education institute, we would still be teaching each other, I suppose. So deep down it is about satisfying curiosity, but I also think there's a big element of passing on knowledge, cultural knowledge, societal knowledge, scientific knowledge, practical knowledge. So those basic things are for me what education is about.
Okay.
In terms of the direction that you asked, wow, that's a big question that we must debate a lot, I guess. But when it starts unbundling everything, as Gary said, it's such a wicked problem, and you can approach it from so many angles. It's complex, it's interlocked, and he said it's whack-a-mole. So I love that expression of his. So you try to change something, and everything else starts changing with it. So I could say something about a certain direction, and it would change the whole story and the whole picture. So it is a wicked problem to discuss and debate. But as a first, well, my first thing would be the direction should be still about access to education for everyone as a basic point. And how can we make that happen?
Okay. So curiosity, whacking moles. Joe, you wanted to come
Well,
in.
no, I was just sort of picking up on what Connie was saying about the whack-a-mole, which is quite a great, which is quite a good analogy, really. You know, you hit something somewhere and something else pops up, and you know, from my perspective, I think that sort of whole systems perspective on how things work and the effect that one thing has on another is a hugely important part of how we understand much more about that, but very much about the fundamentals of how we educate young people today is more about not kind of like the we were talking earlier in the studio about learning, you know, your times table or the kings and queens of our respective countries, but more about why that's important and how to use that learning and thinking to actually be able to, as you say, kind of provide better good, the civic responsibility that some people that we feel that people ought to have within society. So it's about how you think and how you're able to use that knowledge going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alex.
To me, the purpose of education is about learning how to live in a wider system. So a bit like what Joe was saying. How do we live in that wider system, ensuring that the relations between the elements of the systems are harmonious? So basically, us with our relation with nature, us in our relation with the economic system and the environmental system. So how can we live harmoniously and learn that at the level of higher education, so that we become more resilient and adaptive to change during our lifetime, ensuring the next life cycle at the same time for others.
Okay. Obviously, the big question then is how do we actually do that? But maybe we should go on to that later on. I think that we've got two particular points here. We've got this idea of passing on knowledge, so reproduction of society, and we've got this idea of learning for the future. So how do you see those two actually playing out? So we were talking earlier about monasteries. So maybe this is a useful point, a useful time to bring monasteries up.
Wow, I'm not an historian, so I may be saying completely stupid things here. But we were just talking about what if this unbundling really happens and the whole middle is taken out, so that you get these, top class, big brand universities, and there's all these niches that are being filled with wonderfully nimble and agile initiatives that change all the while and that allow access to education. And then, but wouldn't that in a way be a little bit like the Middle Ages, when there was the monasteries that were the top brand universities of those days? They were there to capture knowledge and to pass it on to next generations, and the niches, those were the master apprentice kind of teaching that happened, or training that happened for very specific, very practical jobs like blacksmith or tailor, with jobs that we don't really have anymore. But maybe there's a parallel there. If that is the future unfolds the way Gary describes it, we may end up in the dark ages, but it may not have to be so dark, really. So I'm not sure about that.
Right.
But could we make a parallel there?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I agree with Connie. That's kind of, there are, and I suppose that brings me on to sort of two different aspects of education, which can, in some ways, and I don't know whether anybody agrees with me here, but that you can split them into training and education. So, training is very much about a kind of a desired outcome. So you're training people to do things like the blacksmith role, whereas learning and teaching to, or learning to think, is a very different thing. And I think that's a very fundamental part of education, and something perhaps that is missing in many education systems. We drive people through the system to do things rather than to think about what they're doing, and that sort of lifelong learning to think is hugely important, particularly as we're moving into a new economy. We need to allow young people to be able to operate within this new economy, but also to be able to shape it. And that sort of bigger picture systems thinking, I think, is going to be hugely important. And I think you can train people quite easily, but it's quite difficult to get people to fundamentally think about why they're doing something and how they can influence.
That's a good point, because it also reminds me, because we're talking higher education all the while, but these universities, they also have a research part. So it's like part of the university's job is to educate people. The other part is to do research, and preferably fundamental research, so that we further our knowledge. And that sometimes, if you're saying training people to think and to do fundamental thinking, that's where research also starts coming in. So Gary's claim that we may see the complete abolishment of tenured positions. I think the reason we have tenured staff is because we want to retain talented researchers and give them something like, you are good, please feel free to expand your research area and don't worry about jobs. So we take some worry away from you and give you the space you need to develop up your thinking. And then also, if you're really good, you will inspire a whole range of students to think along with you and help further your knowledge field. Very generalistic speaking.
Alex.
Yeah, from what Gary is explaining, I mean, I see it very much aligned to your linear economy, where you design a product, you deliver the product, and you buy the product, and then you get a reward at the end. So, leading to mass production of education. I mean, the education system is producing numerous diplomas and recognition that have no value on the job market, because they are not fitted to the requirements that are constantly changing from the businesses. So to me, it's all good news, because if I compare it to circular economic concepts, it's about education as a service. It's about accessing education more easily in a customized way instead of being mass delivered. picking and choosing what we need when we need it during our lifetime and our career, decentralized, distributed. So all of that is to me great news. Obviously, it means a lot of agility and adaptability of the universities and college, and as well as the businesses, where you might see some blurring role between business and college and universities, but it might be challenging, obviously, like any changes, but seems to be good news.
And I know you've got some great examples of that you're going to talk about in a minute. So it seems to me that we have to distinguish between good education and bad education when we're looking at the future of education. So if we're looking at reproduction, going back to this monastery, they were reproducing religious knowledge. Again, we were talking earlier about how business schools could be reproducing, could be seen in that light, and they're reproducing knowledge that could be seen as damaging to the environment and society, at least traditional business schools, whereas things like engineers are sorely unrepresented. So what's good education then?
What's good education?
If we're talking about how to reform it, what is good education?
Right.
Wow. That's a horrible question.
Are you going to go for that one, Connie?
Do you want to give it a try?
I mean, just a point on that, if I may. Gary is explaining to us the reason for going to college or not going to college, and whether you are ready to pay to go to college because you will earn so much during your lifetime. So while this is quite an American-centric point of view, I mean, other countries are following that kind of model. But it reduces education and pick and choose of your diplomas and the name that you will put on the CVs to money. And money as your reference for future successes. And I have an issue with that, because if you build your upcoming economy based on the knowledge that you will gain from universities and colleges, that success needs to be translated into value creation. Whichever value you think creates something positive for the people, for the environment, for the economic system, all through together. We don't have to put them in silos, but you through your learning, you have to create value somehow during your lifetime. It's not only about generating money or monetary goals, but within the value, the money will come along. Okay, but the more you create values, the more you will generate financial returns. But I have an issue with just deciding on finances.
Right. And I know that you had a point on that, didn't you, Connie, about the use of finance and the ultimate goal of education. Is it finance?
Well, yeah, well, point is definite. It shouldn't be. And I think you said what is not good education, I totally agree with Alexander, that it should not be purely based on how much you can earn with what you study, which is anyway a short-term perspective, because the market is changing dynamically. So you may find a study that earns you well one day and it will have to completely change the next day. So so if that's going to be our marker for quality of education, then we're in a very bad place indeed. So I totally agree that looking at values would be a much better place to start. But how are you going to measure this? This is a classic conundrum, of course, that we're dealing with. We know that we can hardly measure environmental impact. So how can you ever measure positive impact that you may have, positive value that you may have? So it's a hard one. That's why I said it's a horrible question. What is good education?
Well, I think we can introduce Peter Hopkinson now. Peter Hopkinson is the Professor of Innovation and Environmental Strategy at the University of Bradford in the UK, and he has something to say about the commoditisation of education, at least in the UK. So let's roll that video.
So, higher education at the moment is a global business. You know, when I use that term, you know, sort of intentionally, that it's large numbers of students, large amount of student fees, and the individual universities are becoming more business-like and more commercial. So the demand for higher education is increasing globally, particularly in developing countries. So in many parts of the world, higher education is still seen as a pathway to an improved education and an improved future standard of living, quality of life. Okay. So a lot of what I'm going to say is probably taken from a Eurocentric perspective, but I think it's generally applicable across the globe. And what we've got is we're moving away from what was effectively a 19th century model for universities of a small number of students, a relatively small proportion of the population having access to higher education, usually free at the point of entry, sponsored or subsidised by the state, in some sort of unspoken social contract. Higher education is seen as a public good, that it's seen as a good thing, and the people who went to university would then come out with a sense of societal, civic responsibility, as well as entering a profession. So there was some sort of trade-off, but that model is under huge strain, and in the UK and in other countries we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years a change in that model, okay, with the introduction of student fees. There's been common practice in the United States for a long time, and in some other countries there have been private universities where paying a fee has been traditional or standard or common practice. So we've seen expansion of higher education. So in the UK, for example, now 50% of young people leave school going into higher education of some form or another, but they pay a fee. And those fees have increased significantly in recent times. So it started off at £1,000, then £3,000, this is per annum, then £9,000, and now we're getting another uplift through recent changes at a government level. So £10,000 a year for your fees. It's a student loan, which then attracts an interest rate. So if you're on a 3-year degree, you come out with a loan of £30,000, plus you take out a loan for your living expenses and your accommodation. So typically a student now can come out with a debt of £50,000, you know, there or thereabouts. We've sort of created a structure and a system now which I think subtly and fundamentally changes the relationship between people entering higher education and their sense of what they do next, and their sense of what they should give back. You know, that sort of social contract, that civic, public good notion, I think is being eroded. It's not disappeared, but I think it's being eroded. Because obviously if you're paying at the point of use, then you view the world differently if you're coming out with a debt of £50,000 compared to historically not coming out without a debt. But the consequences, I think, is we've got a generation who have been where debt has been, you know, sort of linked to education, that affects their ability then to what they can spend, which I think has an impact on the economy as a whole. So if you're coming out with lots of debt, your patterns of spending and your patterns of saving change significantly. With that is significant changes in the labour market. So, you know, jobs for life, if they ever existed, have pretty well long disappeared. So we're into the era of portfolio careers. The arrangements for pensions have changed dramatically, so we're now into sort of personalised pensions. But if you've got £50,000, you know, debt, taking on a private pension. I mean, it's always been difficult for young people to think about pensions, 10, 30, 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future. But it's even more difficult now because if you have, supposedly having to set aside 10% of your income, 15% into a private pension, which is what's recommended, and you've got a £50,000 debt. It's a difficult cause. So it's the reduction and the dilution of secure employment-based pensions, I think, has been another significant impact. And then the job insecurity. Some of the jobs that were out there in the past have gone. New jobs have been created. Many of them in finance and the service sector. Some of the financial jobs, it's questionable whether some of those jobs are actually part of the problem, part of the contribution to some of the economic turmoil and problems that led up to the financial crash of 2007 and 8. So we've seen what we refer to as the increasing financialisation of the economy, increasing amounts of debt, and debt-led economic growth, which is driven by the financialisation era, and that's bringing people into those careers. So it's a really interesting sort of discussion and analysis about what's going on in the economy now, what that does to higher education, what it does to young people or not so young people who are entering and then coming out of education, and how they view the role of that education in terms of how they then live, and how they think about the future, and how they think about politics, how they think about economics, how they think about social responsibility, how they think about senses of duty and entitlement, and so on and so forth.
There we go. Welcome back. I'd just like to point out we do have our first Twitter question. Reminder that you can tweet us at #ThinkDiff. And I will read this out, but I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to pass it off onto the next session. So at We Not Know, why are unis still based in iconic buildings? Is it time to switch to online-friendly studios with high bandwidth, etc., like this one? I'm sure it is. However, there's a session at 11:20 on the role of technology in the future of learning, so please tune in then, and you might want to retweet your question, but thank you. So we've seen Peter Hopkinson, a rather I know, it seems dystopian view of the future where education is for cash and we start thinking about students as customers. Is this inevitable though? I think the advantage in the studio today, we have Alex from France and South Africa and Connie from the Netherlands, who are going to give their opinions from their particular countries. But Joe, is this commoditization of education inevitable, do you think? And what are the implications if it is?
Is it inevitable? Gosh, that's a really difficult question. You're really full of difficult questions today, aren't you, Mike? I think, if we sort of look at the UK in particular, the sort of neoliberalist approach to politics and how we run society has had a huge influence on universities. And led particularly to them becoming seen more like businesses. So I think if you do have a political system that supports that, then I think it's inevitable that industries and all of the other organisations within society are going to inevitably turn towards being more like businesses. I mean, we have a situation very much with the National Health Service itself in the UK and education. So I don't think it's inevitable, but I think we need to have strong guidance from policies and government to avoid this perhaps from happening.
Okay, and what do you think the implications are then if this does happen, if we don't get that government steer towards something different?
So I think we'll probably end up with perhaps the middle dropping out of higher education, as Gary explained, and also as Peter supported that, and perhaps a division of the elite being able to afford to go to university, whereas some of those that are not perhaps as privileged are left to try and find education through other routes, which I'm not saying it would be good or bad, but just sort of moving towards the digital technology scenario, which is part of this discussion. I mean, we talk about it being the unbundling of higher education, but unbundling to me gives a sense of something that is opening up and being freer and more sort of systemic. But in actual fact, the unbundling is causing more siloed approaches to education in a way. So you would access the internet, for example, to find out a small bit about something without ever being able to understand the bigger systems perspective. So I wonder whether there is a tension between this unbundling and the use of digital technology, which is actually at odds with the learning around systems thinking that that I think all of us agree is really important for a future economy.
So unbundling may then actually stop us appreciating this systems
Perhaps.
glue, systems view that we think that we need to solve some of these big problems in the future. What are your experiences of this, Connie?
Well, I experience it well. If I would just like to pick up on the siloed, I think that's a very valid point, because if you think through Gary's and Peter's reasoning, the sort of inevitability of creating this huge gap between the elite that has the high brand university access and the social networks, and those that are not part of this elite, and that will have to sort of make do with all kinds of probably innovative and wonderfully designed courses, but still, which feels not good to me. And then you have the point of, if you start siloing things, you stop making it a systemic perspective, but you also create this. I can imagine this huge area of all these different initiatives that are popping up in niches and developing specific education for specific people, and then you get this sort of thing like, how are you going to sort of maneuver through that huge, let's say, field of silos, and how are you going to actually find your way as somebody who has not been educated really? So is that good education? That's a valid question, and isn't it also a little bit that you get the tyranny of choice, as you said before, that you have so much to choose from? How do you know which is good for you? So there's lots of new questions popping up then. So in a way, I can sort of side with Peter on the dystopian perspective, that I'm not sure that taking out the middle and then making the gap wider between elite and everybody else is a good thing necessarily, not for education and not for society.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's good to know that we might be in a job still. So that's nice.
Well, I suppose that's one of the other implications, isn't it? Is on the the academic, the role of the professional academic, in terms of where they sit if this inevitable unbundling takes place. Yeah.
Well, we may be losing our tenured jobs,
Well,
so I'm not sure that we're in such a good place then.
So we have a question coming from Will789GB. Are universities where the media was 20 years ago? Where was the media 20 years ago?
I suppose that's what Gary was talking about when
Yeah.
he said
Yeah.
he'd got an if that's where his background was, and that the whole of journalism and media became unbundled, so you could divide it into certain categories of delivering internet or content, etc. I can't remember exactly how he divided it, but that's kind of what he was saying. And I suppose what the question is about, are universities there? Have we already started unbundling?
And it's also probably because the media sector is much more exposed to the public than the universities, which are kind of secret places where the learning is protected, and so most probably yes. I mean, the media started unbundle years ago, before the education sector. Yeah.
But I think that one of the interesting counters to that point could be look at where media is today and how few news sources are used by so many people, especially when you consider people like Fox News and the Murdoch press, which controls a lot of, and Facebook, of course, controlling news feeds. They won't like that. So we unfortunately we've got a few minutes, only got a few minutes left. So we're going to skip the next video, but we're going to talk about what innovations you actually see there. So Alex, I know that you have some really interesting ideas where you're trying to bring in some of the concepts from the circular economy into education. So please, we'd love to hear about them.
Well, thanks, Mac. Well, basically, when you look at the upcoming wave of changes in the education space, where Gary was explaining that we are in a very linear perceptions where you pick and choose a product, you buy it, and you get a certificate from that product. Whereas in a circular economy, you access things, and it's not about commoditizing the content. The content still has a lot of value. It's just granting more access and lowering the barrier to accessing the economic system, which is good news. And the idea is to say, okay, how about in an innovative thinking, turning the systems around instead of paying upfront for a certificate that you will get in 4 years from now? How about having the universities and colleges coming and choosing the best student or the student that are most suitable for a certain type of learning or education system, and be paid and recognized on achievements, on outcomes. Okay, output. I build 10 schools in this area, but have you improved the education system in that area? Outcome is not measured, and that's what Connie was saying. It's difficult to measure, but today we are able to measure some kind of total return of one activity or one program, and there are methods for that. But the idea is to say, can we, instead of gaining so many certificates and diplomas and recognition from different institutions just to have an impressive CV, can we instead have the educational institution be paid or recognized upon achievement that are made during our careers? We could think about performance economy, where I have performed thanks to my the institution that was supporting me with my success in life. I have performed in terms of value generation as well as revenues and fixing issues and restoring the economy by intention and design, very circular. And we could think about performance economy, where we will pay some paybacks to the universities based on our success, whichever the meaning of success is. So that could be the other way around.
I like that idea.
Yeah. Well, let's see what an educator thinks about that. So, performance-related education. Do you think that's a good idea, Connie?
Well, in a way, we're doing it, I suppose, but then in a very watered-down way, because we are being paid for every student that we deliver, if you like. So that's also a way so we perform our tricks and get the student to graduate, and then we get some money back. But you could make that a much more rich way of thinking. That's what I get from what you're saying. So if you would take that very 1-0 binary approach, like you have a master degree or you don't, put it into something much more valuable for society, and start trying to find ways to measure that. So then you get the real performance economy going within the education system, which it's a new idea to me, but I love the implications of it. So I'd like to think about it in more detail. But a very promising idea. Thank you.
I just like the idea of being able to create a longer term relationship with people within the community, and I think that kind of brings us back to almost a sort of Grecian approach to education, where the space or the arena that people would can't remember exactly what it's called, but the place where people would be educated would be a place for debate and discussion for the local community. So you'd have a much more longer term relationship with that, and one perhaps which is more productive for both the university in terms of developing insights and knowledge within the university, and the wider community. So you've got much more of a kind of flexible relationship between that is able to respond quite quickly. And I think one of the the problems or the challenges that universities are going to have within this unbundling is their ability to adapt quickly. They can't adapt as quickly as perhaps new technology can. But I think they're going to have to. But if they can sort of recreate or create a new relationship, like businesses are doing with leasing models, etc., if they can create a much more kind of two-way process with their community, then I think it could be a really positive outcome for the role of higher education within society.
Fabulous. And on positive notes, I think we'll leave it there. We've run out of time, unfortunately, a somewhat truncated session. So thank you, Joe Miller, Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Thank you, Connie Backer, TU Delft. Thank you, Alexandre Lemille, Circular Economy Africa Network, for a fascinating discussion. Next up, we have a keynote from Gilly Salmon. Gilly is the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Education Innovation at the University of Western Australia. She's a digital learning innovator and is going to talk on The Last Bastion, which introduces the next session, the role of technology in the future of learning. Thank you for tuning in.